Okay, thank you. Good evening, and thank you for joining us on this webinar on the value of organic matter for a resilient farming business. So the funding for this evening's webinar has been provided by the COVID-19 Emergency Farming the Future Emergency Response Fund. The speakers this evening are myself, Karen Fisher. I'm a farming advisor at the Soil Association. My colleague, Paul Flynn, is the Arable and Soil Advisor at the Soil Association, and Becky Wilson, the Project Officer for the Farm Carbon Cutting Toolkit. I'm sure the other presenters will go into this in much more technical detail, but just a brief overview of why does soil organic matter matter. So optimising soil organic matter levels has the potential to fix increased levels of carbon. It improves soil resilience and helps maintain and increase yields. Farmers are in a very fortunate, unique position. Not only can they reduce emissions on their farm through farming practices, but they can also keep carbon out of the atmosphere using resources readily available on their farm. So with the legally binding government net zero carbon farming targets by 2050, the Environmental Land Management Scheme payments based on public goods, and private companies evaluating their environmental credentials, there are definitely, opportunities ahead for having good soil health. Currently, there's quite a lot of background noise. Could you make sure your microphones are muted, please? Thank you. So at the moment, there isn't any mandatory requirements for any business in the UK to actually offset their carbon. Majority of companies are currently doing it because it makes a good PR story. However, so the Farmers Soil Carbon Code is on the horizon in the UK. There's quite a few different carbon marketplaces globally. There's a Nori carbon marketplace in the USA, so this could be something similar to what could be set up in the UK. They pay farmers for incremental improvements over a 10-year period for regenerative farming practices that improve the soil organic matter levels in their soil and therefore soil organic carbon levels. They then pay a maintenance payment after that for farmers to maintain those levels. However, at the moment, there's no mandatory requirement for farmers to have to test their soil organic matter. Some research was done recently by Sheffield University and ADAS looking at sustainable soil management in the UK. They took data from 302 farmers and just over 50% of farmers were testing their soil organic matter from that data set. But if we are to improve our soil health and look at developing income streams and providing public benefits of soil organic matter, we need to have a robust system for measuring and monitoring those levels. So with that in mind, Soil Association, we are launching a new project. It's actually been launched this evening. So this is the Carbon Assets for Soil Health, or CASH for short, project. From this project, we want to see that farmers are rewarded for the public good that great soil management can deliver. And so objectives of this project, we want to provide farmers greater knowledge on how to improve soil quality and increase carbon sequestration. We want to provide evidence that regenerative farming techniques can sequester carbon and secure it long term. And we want to persuade policymakers and developing carbon markets that soil may be as important as trees in helping to reverse climate change. But to do this, we need your help. So if you have been monitoring your soil organic matter levels and you're happy to share that information with us alongside cropping history, management practices, soil types, etc., then your data may give us some of the insights, the evidence we need. Even if you haven't got your historic soil organic matter data, then please still get in touch if you're interested in taking part in the project. If you do take part, then you'll be eligible for some free soil tests on some of your fields over the next 2 years. It might be extended further than that, but at the moment we've got funding for 2 years, and you'll receive results from our research as soon as they are collated. There will be a link in the chat box and also an email to anyone that's taken part in the webinar with an actual link to our webpage for more information and a link to the survey, which will literally take 5 minutes, just take some initial data from you. And anybody that fills in that survey by the end of November, 5 people, lucky winners, will receive either a box of Stroud brewery beer or some organic champagne. So yep, if you're interested or want further information, then you can email me directly at kfisher@soilassociation.org. Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Karen. It looks like it's my turn, so thank you. And again, thank you for coming tonight to join us. It's nice to see you there. I tend to talk for far too long, and I've been limited to 10 minutes, so I've got a very short leash on tonight. So I've only got 10 slides, you'll be pleased to hear. But I would enjoy your questions. There's a few coming up now, I think, on the chat box, and that's great to see. So we're here to support you and really answer your questions too. So let's have a look at the first one then. So on next slide. Thank you. Okay, so I just start. I mean, this is, my apologies to those of you who have been around this blog a few times. But as a farm advisor, I get this question every single week. pH, and I think if nothing else, if if the budget is so limited that we can't do much, let's just get the pH right. And then we're talking, typically around about 6.3, 6.5 for a mixed farm with grassland. And you can see there that I've highlighted that, even for the major nutrients, there's quite a big deal in that once we get below a pH of about 6, 6.5, 5.5, then we begin to lose our availability to the plant. And below 5.5, below 5, even more so. And a reminder there in bold letters that this is a log scale. So if you're as old as me, you'll know that a log is a nice way of keeping quite big numbers rather small. So when we progress from pH of 7 down to 6, then our acidity increases tenfold. Okay, and same again going from 6 to 5. So going from 7 to 5, our soil is now 100 times more acidic than it was at neutral. So being at 5.5, being at 5 is not okay. I know it sounds a bit like 6, but it's not by a long way. So the cheapest thing to do, the best investment you can make, is to apply lime as far as possible. Okay, and next slide, please. Okay, and this is one, just a little, if you like, this seemed to cause some excitement this morning. But landis.org.uk, super job, super site. It's free, which I know that farmers enjoy hearing that. A really lovely, simple way of looking at your land. And if you didn't know already, then a reminder that we're looking here at quite deep soil samples, and in some respects, looking also at the geology of your farm. I love the fact that it has a nice, simple way of sort of relating soil fertility. So it's on a carat scale, 5 carats for a very highly fertile field. This farm came up as an inquiry a few months ago, and we just discussed the idea of what we do where, what we crop where. And you can see there that the land on the right-hand side is blessed by 5 carats, left-hand side is 2 carats. And a bit more detail there too about drainage, about soil types. A really nice place to start. Okay, so that's landis.org.uk. The slides will be available afterwards, and you can come back in your own time and look at that. And also, if you want to be in touch, I'll be available by email or by phone after the meeting. Okay, so next slide. So yeah, another, forgive me again, but a few more basics. If we're going to be involved in cultivation, if we're plowing and reseeding, or we're going back into some new grass, then just have a really good look around the field. Have a just a good walk around. Have a look at where things are going wrong, where the wet patches are, and take a spade, not a trowel. That's my trowel, but ideally take a spade, have a dig, have a look at what's there. In this example, we had a farmer phone me up and said, look, it's kind of done well to begin with, and now it's just not doing so well. And you can see there, perhaps you can work it out for yourself. It's a rotivator that is quite an age. It's become really quite blunt, but most of all, it's been used at the wrong time. That soil has become, it's plastic. You could form a kind of structure with that as it's working. So, a few more days, if not weeks, before that soil would have been in ideal condition. As I said down there, that's it's poor soil management, but it's excellent pottery. That was just baked hard. Yeah, it's okay. No, go on. I like the idea of somebody else having the button. I often give my students the clicker as well. And again, this is back at Penrith. So just showing that the effect of subsoiling, we've chosen here just to subsoil the field margins and the gateway entrances just to relieve conditions. But the point being there that actually looking at the technical data on this, although I like, it's a job I enjoy doing and it's a worthwhile job, actually getting this right is quite difficult. Getting the right conditions where you don't compound the condition and make it worse is quite difficult to do. And the benefits are, they can be good, but it requires a very accurate and a very detailed setting so that your the foot of that subsoil is just beneath the compaction, and also that we're operating again in quite good conditions. Okay, so next one. Thank you. And a quick mention, I couldn't present to the Soil Association without giving some credit to my own soil science teacher back at Aberystwyth, Dr. Victor Stewart, who graduated from Stirling. He was the first person I knew of to really champion the earthworm. And I think that's, as you know, is your best friend. A few bits of data coming through the last few years. This one I quite like, that if you look at the cast itself, it is greatly blessed by having a lot more nutrients in it, and those nutrients being far more available to the plants. The figures are hard to believe. You can see there, 241% more available nitrogen and 84% phosphorus. Yeah, so quite staggering figures, but that's the property of the earthworm. That's what it does for you. And as well, another increase of pH by about 0.5 of a unit typically. A really big improvement in cation exchange capacity, so that our ability to retain other nutrients is much enhanced. And as Dr. Vic Stewart would have said himself, also a much better, crumb structure, a much more architectural structure to that soil as well. Okay, but beware, earthworms are not a feature of heavily cultivated soils. And also take care too, I think, with slurry and biodigestate. Seen quite a few farms. I've yet to get a great picture of it, but just when you go in there with just a bit too much slurry, in the wrong conditions, perhaps a slurry that also is quite potent, seeing an awful lot of earthworms come to the surface and be exposed to predation. So that can be a disaster. Okay, another couple of slides, I think. Now this one's a bit complicated, I do apologise, and this is one, a slight nod towards Becky, who's speaking next. But the idea of grassland as a way to fix carbon, it can be done. The work there by Ease et al. Is quite sceptical. It is, however, a composite experiment based on about 160 different other experiments, and again is open to interpretation. There is some work, it has been done in Holland, as you can guess by the name, Hoogstein, where the more intensive strip grazing regimes are sort of, we hear about mob grazing, about regenerative grazing, that does seem to hold some promise. I think my sort of caveat there is, take your samples, take the soil samples, take your carbon data, and just have a look at how that's progressing. And I think perhaps you might have to get back involved in your own feedback loop as to how that feeds back to your farm. Okay. And next one. Yeah, and just okay, this is perhaps an easy way of doing it, but it is possible to add compost. And I love the idea, especially livestock farmers, of just taking the time to compost their own livestock manures from their own cattle and sheep. And I saw a farmer doing it a few years ago, and he just spoke about it with such enthusiasm. It was in the south of Scotland, and for one thing, if nothing else, it was about a third the volume by the time it was spread, and also much lighter, so caused less compaction. But actually, that farmer went from being a person who bought silage to being a person that sold silage in that same year. It might just be coincidence, but I think actually that carried on for quite a few more years to go. And a reminder too that composting is the foundation of organic farming. I know that this discussion goes beyond organic, but I did in my inspection days meet a farmer who told me that in the 1970s he'd failed his inspection because his compost wasn't good enough. Two more presents for you. The link there, Great Soils, in blue. If you can click on that, you'll find about 3 years worth of work that we did a couple of years ago. Fantastic repository of knowledge, information based on quite a big team of folk, which included the Soil Association and our colleagues. And also, as part of that, I think about compost is good news for soil health, just relating really why that is. And again, even in this last 10 years, we've really justified that decision to go with composting. There are all sorts of other benefits that we now know about, antifungal, antibacterial, antiviral properties too of compost. Okay, yeah, I'm speaking too much. I've had the nod there. That's okay. And then just, I know one or two of you talked about horticultural questions as a nod to that. This is a farm I'm sort of a little bit involved in locally, and we're looking at no-till as a horticultural measure. A little bit of discussion over the issue of nitrate and total nitrate, although actually available nitrate's quite low. But again, in terms of looking at completely different approaches to farming, I love this one because it's a great use of compost. We can bring in compost from other sources, and in particular from green waste composting operations. It's a nice way to recycle waste from an urban environment. But I have a few colleagues now that I'm working with on this, and we, for some of them where the composting is really good and we are almost weed free, this proves to be a very nice way to go. It's certainly a much reduced workload, if nothing else. Okay, I think that's possibly my last one. Some references there for you, and thank you for listening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Okay, so Becky is talking next.
Hello, yes, well, thank you very much, everybody, and thank you for giving up your evening. If it's anything as beautiful as it is down here in Devon, as I say, I'm sure there's lots of other things you could be doing, so it's great to be here. And it's great to be here talking about one of my favourite subjects, which is how we protect and look after soil organic matter, one of our key assets as farmers. So yeah, my name is Becky, and I am project manager at the Farm Carbon Toolkit, a farmer-led organisation that was set up back in 2009 to really try and provide practical tools and resources for farmers in order to let them help understand how to manage greenhouse gas emissions, how that links into business resilience and soil health and profitability. So again, you might say, well, if you're dealing with greenhouse gas emissions, why are you here talking about soil organic matter? Well, soil organic matter has a key part to play, not just in terms of how we manage our soils and how we manage our soil health, but also with the unique and emerging opportunities, as Karen said at the beginning, that are now starting in terms of how do we start to value it, both financially in terms of getting payments back to farmers, but also in terms of the contribution that soil organic matter makes to profitable, sustainable and resilient farming systems, which we're hearing a lot more about resilience now and the role of organic matter in resilience. You look at the weather patterns that we're having that are all over the place, and you look at the changes that we're having. We're having to adapt our systems. We're having to develop systems that are able to hold water when it comes and then actually release it more slowly, and are able to help to pioneer nutrient cycling and other things. Soil organic matter is crucial in that. So as I say, we're just going to have a quick look at some of the work that I've been doing in terms of the Soil Carbon project, and also look at how some of the things that might be coming up in the future in terms of how we're going to navigate the world of payments. Thanks very much. Next slide. So yeah, I mean, this is a really nice quote that I like in terms of, we've done so many amazing things as humans. We've put people on the moon, we've sort of done the internet, we've managed global pandemics in terms of having webinars and getting everybody together. But despite everything we've done as humans, we still owe our existence to that 6 inches of topsoil and the fact that it rains. So it just shows that soil is absolutely crucial in terms of not just for us as farmers, in terms of profitable businesses and making that resilience, but in terms of life as we know it. Thank you. So, how we manage our soils, therefore is incredibly important. So if we can manage our soils in a way which is good and allows, you know, us to have good structure, as Paul said earlier, allow us to have the right nutrient balances and the right pH, allows us to provide a really good habitat for the biology that we're just starting to learn so much more about in terms of the potential in there, then not only can we improve our profitability and our productivity on the farm, we can also start to do that amazing thing in terms of the ability for our soils to fix carbon out of the atmosphere. So it's a really, really good win-win. But how do we do it? And that's something we're going to have a look at. Now, when we first had the agricultural bill that came out, soils wasn't included as a public good. But when it disappeared and then it came back again after the election, soil is now specifically named as a public good. And what that means is that actually now we have that enabling policy to be able to do financial assistance in terms of paying farmers to maintain and manage their soil in whichever capacity we're going to do it, which is a really, really good point, because that's the baseline which we can now start to hang payments on. Thanks, Karen. But it also brings up this issue of how do we define soil health? And soil health is one of those terms. If you think back a few years when we were talking about sustainability was another term that was bandied around quite a lot and actually meant different things to different people. And soil health is another one of those sort of catch-all phrases that actually can mean very different things. I mean, I think we can all probably, imagine what an unhealthy soil is, but how we actually start to define what a healthy soil is quite challenging. And then how do we take it one stage further and say, well, actually, although soil health is really important, soil health is that base layer, and actually what we want to see is how that healthy soil translates up in terms of healthy plants, healthy animals, and ultimately healthy people. And how do we start to really capitulate on that relationship and start to be able to look at how we can track those nutrients from good soil management right the way up into healthy food and healthy people at the end of it. And there's some really exciting work going on in that. I say a lot of my research is very much going in terms of how do we start to quantify these benefits in the soil. And every time we think we've sort of got our head around something else comes in to sort of ping in the way, and it's difficult and complicated. But actually, if we can start to do that holy grail in terms of being able to sort of understand the nutrient density of the food that's coming from those healthy soils, then we've got a whole new exciting conversation to be having with our consumers. Thank you. So it all comes down to soil carbon, and there's been lots and lots of discussions as the climate crisis has sort of risen up people's agendas, and as the sort of we're starting to see the direct impacts of it. There's been lots and lots of attention, and there's been a lot of negative attention on the agriculture, on agriculture's environmental impact. And then when we start to look at what the potential solutions for that are, there's been a huge amount of focus on trees. Now you could say, well, why has there been so much focus on trees? Well, there's been a lot of focus on trees because trees are very, very easy to measure. It is very easy. There's been lots of research gone on in terms of, the type of tree, the age of the tree, the species of the tree, how densely planted together those trees are. And we can use that and we can put it into a computer model and it will tell us how much carbon that's holding. But when we start to look at soils and the carbon holding capacity of our soils, it's much more complicated. We're dealing with complex biological systems. We're dealing with multiple variables in terms of the underlying soil type, in terms of the climate that's falling on top of it, and then in terms of what you guys as farmers are doing in the middle. Then actually it's much more of a messy sort of model to try and understand. And that's one of the reasons why it's been quite overlooked in terms of being able to provide that concrete data that means that these sort of financial mechanisms and markets that are opening up are easily available to us. But undaunted, we shall continue, and we shall see, we shall continue the presentation and see what we can find out in terms of how we measure it. But there is a huge opportunity. We've just got to be able to deal with the measurement and how we manage it and validate it. Thanks, Karen. So if we take it back a minute and just look at what drives a healthy soil and the importance of soil carbon within that soil health triangle. So we've got the soil health triangle, which includes the fact that if we have a healthy soil, it has to be in a good physical state. And I think Paul spoke about that earlier. We've got to be looking at how our soils are structured and whether we've got good amounts of air and water in there and how those soils are made up, and whether we've got good levels of carbon, which is actually driving that aggregation. So driving how our soil particles are sticking together and making sure that we've got enough, as I say, enough air, enough water so that our plant roots can go through it. They're not going to get forced sideways by levels of compaction, and they can go and access nutrients and other things that they want further down. Soil organic carbon is also one of the drivers of chemistry. So it's actually allowing those nutrient balances to happen. And for biology, it's that sort of primer that primes the system. So actually it allows, as I say, our soils to be more biologically active, which means that they have an enhanced nutrient cycling capacity, which means they can go and you know, our plant roots can go and find more phosphorus. It means we can have fantastic fungal associations going on. It means that our bacteria and everything else that lives in the soil can function in the way that helps us as farmers in terms of driving those profitable resilient systems. The soil organic carbon is incredibly important in whichever aspect of soil health that you look at. So we know it's really important. Thanks, Karen. And this was some work that was done back in 2017. And this is quite a nice quote, which just says that soil carbon, although soil carbon is not going to be the silver bullet that sorts all of our issues out, it does offer the cheapest and the most readily near-term implementable option. You know, we're still going to have to do the technologies that are going on in terms of how do we do big scale carbon capture and storage. We're still going to have to reduce our emissions. We're still going to have to look at how we're doing things. But actually, soil carbon offers us this really good opportunity to start to pull carbon out of the atmosphere at the same time as contributing to improvements in soil health and other positive environmental outcomes. So it's a win-win. And we are the ones as farmers, landowners and foresters who can achieve that. Thanks, Karen. So how do we future-proof our soils, and how do we start to look at how we can get these payments or mechanisms or incentives to work for us? And one of the questions that I get asked more than anything is, well, you know, how much is it going to cost, or how much am I going to get paid? And if you look at that graph there, that graph there comes from the base department, you know, business and whatever the rest of it stands for. But this is tracking the carbon price. And basically, if you look at nothing else, there's lots of lines on there. If you look at the direction of where that carbon price is going, and that's looking at optimistic scenarios and non-conservative scenarios. And you can see there that, you know, where we are now in 2020, you know, we're at sort of on the optimistic scale, we're about £30 a tonne, and on the sort of conservative scale, we're down at about £15 a tonne. Now, that's something that we'll remember when we go further on, and I show you what we're finding with some of our soil carbon project research. But as we've said, you know, that building of soil resilience is at the heart of our new policy. And, you know, soils are one of our national assets. But it's really important to remember that it's not just about sequestration. It's also really important to look at reducing emissions from soils. So we need to look at how our soils are structured to mitigate the impact of nitrous oxide. We need to make sure that we've got resilient systems that are doing what we want them to do, so that actually any carbon that we are sequestering, we can actually get paid for more of it, because we're not having to use it to offset our own emissions to start off with. Thank you. Now, another really important thing to think about is that actually we've got two sides of these opportunities. And this is something that I quite often get asked when you say, well, actually, you know, I've been doing these sort of regenerative practices, or I've been looking after my soils for the last 20 years. So actually, you know, am I going to get penalised because my soils are already fairly healthy? And this is the really important thing to remember, is that actually we've got two distinct sets of activity here. We've got the carbon that is already stored in your soil, and you can think about that like your savings account. And you really want to try and protect that as much as possible. And I think what we'll get is a payment for protection of what's already there. So say, for example, you've already been working in this sort of area for a while, your levels or your carbon levels in your soil are going to be higher. Therefore, you're going to get a higher payment for that than somebody who's just started it. When I talk to my students, you know, they always say, well, the best thing for me to do is to go and plough it all up now. So I'm starting from a low baseline so that the amount that I can pull in is higher. But we don't want that to happen. We don't want it to be like, you know, sometimes when they try and look at how we're going to sort out, you know, permanent pasture designations, and it's the quickest way to make everybody go and remove their permanent pasture because they don't want to get it locked in. We don't want to do that, because actually what we don't want to do, although we're getting very, you know, we're talking about carbon sequestration, is we don't want to release any more carbon back up into the atmosphere. So we want to keep that carbon in the soil. So protecting carbon that we've already got in our system is really, really important. And, you know, allowing our soil to be structured well and maintaining soil aggregation is a really important part of that protection of the carbon that we've already got. Thanks, Karen. So that's making sure that we can protect what we've got. Well, but then how do we increase it? So how do we look at how we can actually pull more carbon out of the atmosphere through our green leaves, through our trees and hedgerows and everything else on the farm, and hold it in our soils? Now, the traditional way of measuring this, if we look at the the greenhouse gas emission models that are out there, traditionally there's a different category for carbon sequestration, which is called land use change, and forestry. And the traditional way of modelling this, which is one of the reasons why we've got to the point where we've got, is that they would say that the only way that you can increase soil carbon within your fields is, if it is a grassland field, is that you turn it into forestry. And if it's an arable field, you turn it into grassland. Or if it's an arable field, you can sort of supercharge it and go straight to the forestry. But we all know that within our farms and on our farms, we'll have those fields that perform better and those fields that perform worse. And we know that within the broad definition of grassland, or the broad definition of arable, there are lots and lots of variations. So we need to look at how we can increase soil carbon within that pool that we're already in. And there's a few sort of golden rules. Firstly, if we reduce the amount of soil that is leaving the field, then not only are we going to stop the carbon leaving, we're also going to do fantastic things in terms of our soil health, in terms of next year's cropping, in terms of retaining nutrients, because actually if that soil is leaving the field, it's also taking with it phosphorus, which we don't want to happen with all the environmental impacts of that. So keeping the soil where we want it to be, so that's keeping it in good structure, that's making sure that we've got something growing, keeping the soil covered, putting that armour on the soil is really, really important. We're then looking at, well, let's feed some more organic material into the system. So let's, like Paul was saying, let's have some compost, let's have some FYM, let's have some other things that are putting more sources of organic matter into the system. Then we're going to reduce the amount of carbon that's leaving the system by reducing the amount of cultivation and tillage that we're doing. And then there's some really exciting work looking at how can we actually start to put some of that carbon further down the soil profile through actually starting to incorporate deep roots and actually start to put that further down where it's less likely to come back up. Thanks, Karen. So what does this sort of all boil down to in terms of questions? Well, questions for policymakers. How do we start to create a policy on these complex biological systems that actually, you know, completely depend on the weather, on other things that are going on, and have management in there as well, and are non-replicable? So we can't say it's this one magic practice that actually applied on every single farm across the whole of the UK would have the same results. It's really, really tricky. What can we measure? So is it a case of measuring soil organic matter? Do we need to measure something else? And then how do we measure it? Do we get you guys, the farmers, to measure it? Do we do it using precision farming or new technology? Do we use it using satellites? How do we actually do it? Can we pay people against it? And how do we? So how can we use some of the stuff that's happening around the world to start to learn that best practice so that we can have a system that works? The systems that are currently working out there at the moment are great, but they're on different scales to what we're on here in the UK. So how do we make it work for us? It's all a bit new and a bit scary. Thanks, Karen. So that's the questions for policymakers. The questions for farmers is, well, you know, as I said earlier, we need to protect the carbon that we've already got. That's number one. And we should be doing that because it's providing us a really good, you know, opportunity in terms of maintaining our soil quality and crop production. Carbon payments are an additional extra. But we need to provide evidence in terms of what works within the different management practices. So is it that we all have to go no-till, or is min-till just as good? If I plant a herbal ley, how much carbon is that holding me? That's the question that I get asked probably about 3 times a week. What's the deal with clover? Is it just clover, grass clover, or do we have to put 15 other species in there? How does it matter in terms of how I graze it? What's with the use of cover crops and the diversity of that? The use of different farmyard manures or different digestates or compost. How does that all work? And what are the thresholds in terms of how much carbon those are holding us? And we need to develop this data from farm level data, which is actually looking at that holistic system rather than models, because models are fantastic and models give us that idea in terms of being able to look across the whole spectrum. But actually for an individual farmer, what inspires the most confidence is data in terms of what's happening on your individual farm. And all of that starts with knowing what and how to measure. Thanks, Karen. So if we go back to what was the sort of original question, how can we make money from soil carbon? Well, there are potentially payments for increasing soil carbon. And again, those could be from the government through an ELMS type scheme, or they could be from private finance. We can increase our crop yields and our crop quality, so we can get those agronomic benefits by increasing our soil carbon. So that's improving the quality or the output of what we're producing as farmers. But it still comes back down to that question of how can we prove that the soil carbon is increasing? And that's very much what we've been looking at with our soil carbon project. Thanks, Karen. So our soil carbon project is a partnership project. It's a partnership project between us at Farm Carbon Toolkit, Duchy College, Rothamsted Research, Northwick, and then some other businesses in the southwest. And this project really came about from a couple of reasons. Firstly, at FCCT, we run the Soil Farmer of the Year competition. And the Soil Farmer of the Year competition is a fantastic competition, and I would urge any of you guys to enter it next year. We're actually announcing the results of this year's tomorrow. And the top 3 farmers from the Soil Farmer of the Year competition always hold a farm walk. And we would go to these amazing farms that were doing fantastic things. We would stand in a field, a beautiful field of crop or a beautiful grass field, and the farmer would stand up and say, you know, I've completely transformed my system. You know, my crops are healthier, I'm putting on less fertilizer, my animals are doing brilliantly, my yields are brilliant. And my question back to them, my first question back to them always would be, that's brilliant. But did you take any tests before you started? So have you got any data in terms of before you started to where you are now? And the overarching response was always no. So when I started to dig a bit deeper into this and say, well, why didn't you test? The responses that came back were always the same. I didn't know what to test for. I'm not convinced that some of the tests that are out there are actually telling us the right things. So that's really the whole premise behind this project. Thanks, Karen. It's answering 3 main questions. And the 3 main questions are really understanding, okay, how do we test? What is the deal with testing? Are we testing soil organic matter? Are we testing soil organic carbon? How does that link through to other soil health functions? Very much, how do we take the samples in the field? What's the deal with depth? So we're looking across 3 different depths so that we can start to understand what's going on down the soil profile in terms of that transfer of carbon. Can we link any of that data to soil proxy measures? So, you know, some of the statistics that are often shown are things like if you can improve your soil organic matter by 1%, by 0.1%, then you can sequester an extra 9 tons of carbon, you can hold an extra 16,000 litres of water, and you can make available more nutrients. Can we actually prove some of that stuff? How much carbon can be offset on farm? So what are the opportunities for carbon positive farms? And what are those management practices that make a difference? Thanks, Karen. So we've got a range of farmers involved, as you can see from the map there. The majority of our funding comes from the southwest, so we've got that, but we've got about 90 farms involved that are running a range of farming systems, soil types, management systems, so that we can really start to understand what happens across a different range of farms. Thanks, Karen. And they're really, really important in terms of their understanding and their knowledge of what's happened previously, because we want a lot of information, as Karen said with her new project, we want that information in terms of that management that's happened to those fields over the past 5 to 10 years, so that we can start to attribute some of those things. What are we testing? Well, we're testing soil organic matter and soil organic carbon at those 3 depths, so 0 to 10 centimetres, 10 to 30 centimetres, and then 30 to 50 centimetres. We're looking at carbon to clay ratios, because that's really, really important. We're looking at carbon to nitrogen ratios. We're looking at total organic carbon. We're looking at how carbon varies across the field. And we're also looking at how the labs analyse it. So we're doing a big piece of work in terms of lab analysis. We're looking at bulk density so that we can start to do carbon yields. And we're also looking at whether we can link any of this to proxy points. So we're doing soil structure, worm counts and classifications, infiltration, aggregate stability, and biological activity. Thanks, Karen. So what have we found? Just a few bits to finish off on. In terms of testing advice, I found this quote on Twitter the other day and I thought it was brilliant. The best time to start testing was 10 to 20 years ago. If we didn't do that, then the second best time to start is today. And there's a few key things to remember. First thing, make sure that when you take your samples and send them off, you send them to the same lab. We are doing a calibration piece at the moment where we are sending about 30% of all the samples are going off to about 5 different labs, so we can start to do the correction curves, but there is a big difference. So it's really important to make sure that you send your samples to the same lab. It's also really important that you send your samples at the same time of year, because we're also doing some work where we're tasting from the same fields every month. And the variation is big. So actually make sure you take your samples at the same time of year. If you want to do it, you know, if you want to really bells and whistles it, GPS log your sample points across the field, so that then when you go back and you retest, you know that you're taking from the same parts in the field. And actually then you see, if you do that, you can then, you know, and you get changes, you then know that your changes aren't due to sampling error, they're actually due to your management. And the depth of sample and consistency of the sample that you're taking at depth is really, really important. If you want, as I say, if you want some more advice, or if you want our protocol, we're very happy to share our protocol of how we do it, and then that obviously allows you to be able to compare yours with the farms and the data that we've got in our project. Thanks, Karen. The other really exciting thing we found is this link between soil organic carbon content and soil aggregate stability. So, and it's really, really good because it means that you can send a sample off to the lab and you can pay for a sample every 5 years, every 10 years. But this test you can all do for free, and you don't need any techie equipment. You can all go out and do it tomorrow. So you basically go into the field and you dig a hole and you take a fistful of soil and you put it on a sunny windowsill, or you put it in the airing cupboard to dry. And then, as I say, you submerge it in water. And it's a bit like when you submerge a biscuit into a cup of tea. What you want is you want it to be one of those brilliant dunking biscuits that you can dunk again and again and again. And that soil aggregate sticks together, because that stuff that's sticking it together is the glues and all those sort of things that are provided produced by the soil biology and the soil organic matter. And we found a really, really good relationship. And so one of the things we're working on at the moment is just publishing that in a way that allows farmers to understand whether their soils are moving in the right direction. So soil organic matter or soil organic carbon tests every 5 years, 10 years. In the meantime, you can do aggregate stability tests and see how your soil's behaving. Thanks, Karen. Another really interesting thing we've found so far is the impact of grazing, and this idea that if you can move from set stock to rotational, or if you want to go even further over to mob grazing, it seems to be improving our soil carbon levels from 0.1% to 0.6% per hectare per year. And if you remember that 0.1% sequesters on average about 9 tonnes of carbon. And if you think back to that carbon pricing I was giving you there, if you work on a conservative price of £20 a tonne, it suddenly adds up across your fields. So we're really cautiously optimistic that actually these practices do have an important role. If you can include deep rooting species into that sward, then that supercharges that process, because as I said earlier, you're also moving that carbon further down. If you can diversify the species within your grassland, you're also diversifying that rooting depth, which is really good for soil health, because you're able to access nutrients and water and other stuff that's further down. And also, if you can include legumes and reduce your fertilizer, it's a good help, not just for soil carbon, but it also reduces your emissions, because nitrogen fertilizer has a very high greenhouse gas emission associated with it. Thank you, Karen. So just finally, because I know I've waffled on for far too long, what does this all mean? So through the work that we've been doing with the soil carbon project, we've now realised that we've got a way of measuring soil carbon that is both verifiable and cost effective. If we have soil health as a public good, you know, what do we pay farmers on? Are we paying farmers on soil organic matter? Are we paying farmers on soil organic carbon? And how does that whole process work? How often are we going to test? So are we going to test every 5 years? Are we going to test every 10 years? And how accurate does that test need to be? Are we going to have to validate some of those management practices by using satellite data, or by using other precision farming equipment? And how much validity is going to happen in terms of at the farm level? So are we going to have to GPS tag where we're taking the samples from? Are we going to have somebody else external off the farm who's going to come and take the samples? All of that needs to be sorted out. There are different global models already that are available that are doing carbon payments. Farmers are being paid around the world to sequester carbon in soils. So the precedent has already been set. In Australia, we've got a version that works by measurement. In America, we've got a version that works on a model. And then in Canada, we've got a hybrid version that is mainly model-based but is verified by measurements. We need to make sure that we can differentiate between carbon stock and carbon sequestration. So our current account, which is our carbon sequestration, versus our savings account. And then I do think that they are going to be two completely separate payments. I think ELMS type thing is going to be a carbon stock payment, and carbon sequestration very may well sit within the private finance. And there's loads and loads of private finance interest at the moment, which includes lots of new companies that are starting to pull in a lot of equity, and they want to spend that money with farmers. Thanks, Karen. So again, happy to have discussions on that. So yeah, thank you very much. Apologies, I went on a little bit longer. If anybody has any questions, if anybody wants to get in contact with me, please do. There's my details, and I'd be more than happy to help, or as I say, or pass on our protocols and all that sort of stuff. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Becky. Thank you, Karen and Paul. We have had a few questions in already. But yeah, just pop your questions in the chat box. We've got a bit of time now until 7 to take them. There's a couple that just came in about testing while you were talking, Becky. Interesting. Why are the labs producing such different results? Do you have any insight into that?
It's a really interesting question. When we first started the project, we were very focused on the field how we take the samples in the field and making sure that we are taking those in a robust way. And you almost thought that once you packaged it up on the farm and sent it off to the lab, well, the any bits that were going to be varied had been done by that point. But when we, as I say, and we sent a few samples off around a range of labs just to see what was happening. And what we found, and when I've tried to look into this in a bit more detail, is the fact that although there are standards out there in terms of for loss on ignition and for looking at the analytical methods, there is a massive variation in terms of the temperatures at which the labs burn their samples for. So, the basic preparation for a sample is that you pass it through a sieve, you weigh it, and then you burn it in an oven, and then you weigh it again. And obviously, the traditional loss on ignition is how much of that you've lost during that burning process. But what we found, as I say, when I've been looking at the protocols and how the labs are processing these samples, is that, the temperature at which their ovens are at will vastly differ. The time at which their samples are in the oven will also differ. And then there's other interesting things like, whether they provide you the results back as 1 decimal place or 2 decimal places, or potentially some of the, the Rothamsteds who are providing those information at 4 decimal places. So it's the level of accuracy in terms of how they're reporting. But even having said that, so with the labs that we're working with, you can also have, something will throw a bad result. So we've had a few that have come back that have looked completely off. And my advice back to farmers would always be, if something looks off, it's always worth challenging the labs back and saying, actually, this is a bit of a weird result. And we've had a few that we've said that looks a bit weird, and then they've retested them, and actually, the first result hasn't been great. So that's why I was saying about making sure that you stick with your lab, because although there is variation between labs, and as I say, we're starting to produce those calibrations or those correction curves, which means that if you do switch labs, or if, for example, you've got a historical sample that was taken 10 years ago that was at one lab, and then you've taken one more recently, because you've changed lab or something, we can probably do some corrections on that. But from now on, it's much better in terms of trying to limit all the variation to just stick with the one lab. And what I'm hoping is that when we start to get the grassland code and all that good practice that will hopefully come with these payments, is that there will be as much attention driven on the lab side of it, as there is in terms of how we take the samples as farmers, because we've got to have consistency there as well. Otherwise, we're just basically chucking it all into the air, aren't we, in terms of if we can't compare across. So it's certainly something that needs to happen, and one of the outputs of our soil carbon project is that we are providing we're just at the end stages of producing a practical guide for farmers in terms of how to take samples at the farm, but also a guide for labs in terms of some of those things to consider in terms of how we take a sample in a way which is consistent.
Thank you. That's brilliant. We did have a question about if you've got any preferred labs. I wonder if would you be happy to share the details of the ones you're working with? Maybe we could send that round in an email afterwards.
Yes, no problem at all. Yeah, I mean, we've sent samples off to all the main commercial labs, and some of the new and emerging labs that are coming out now. So there's a couple of new ones that are looking at things more on the biological testing side of it. And there's lots of really exciting things happening in terms of all of that we can now DNA sequence all the things that live in our soils. But again, we also need to just look at what are we going to use those results for? And that's one of the things when we look at some of the soil biology testing, is that it's a great nice to know, but actually, are you going to do anything different off the back of the results? And actually, it might be very nice to have a big long report saying that I've got X trillion species of this, but actually, unless you're going to do something with that result, it sometimes we need to make sure they're practically relevant.
Brilliant. Okay, fab. Again, on testing, is there a best time of year to compare soil analysis?
So traditionally, the best times for soil organic matter testing, the best, traditionally it's always been done in the spring or the autumn. The really important thing to do, especially if you're looking at depth and what's going on through the depth, is if you've done any cultivation, is to let the ground settle for at least 6 months before you take the samples. And especially if you're, especially if you've been ploughing and you're looking at what's going on through depths, obviously you've turned the soil upside down, so it's all going to be all over the place. So certainly, spring or autumn are good. But again, as I said, as long as you're consistent when you then retest, as long as you're doing it at the same time of year, then you're gonna be able to see the change that is more attributed to your management rather than the fact that you're doing it at a different time of year. I mean, I was amazed. We've got I say 3 fields at Duchy that we're measuring on a monthly basis. We've got a permanent pasture, temporary grass, and an arable field, and it's on all of them. The variation was almost up at sort of 4.5–5% across the year.
Wow.
So actually, you can think, my goodness, I'm doing amazing things, but actually, if you're just testing it, at a different time of year, then it could just be that variation. So it's really important to just make sure that you test at the same time of year, and it has to fit in with your, with your crop management and everything else. I didn't know whether Paul, you want to add anything in terms of testing from the non-organic matter slide.
Really, it depends what you want. I mean, I think for the price you're paying, which I think is really quite reasonable. I mean, you're paying between £40 and £65. I would just say, if nothing else, make sure that you're doing it. And then also, unless you've spent some time doing that in your career, I would take advice. If you're paying that much for the testing, follow through, speak to us. We generally don't charge for that kind of inquiry, and let's discuss your sample with you and see what that can tell us.
Brilliant, thank you.
Yes, soil organic matter tests are £5.50 plus VAT sample, so they're not expensive.
No, not at all. No.
Bargain. There's a question which Paul's answered. I don't know if anyone wants to expand on a little bit. And keep your questions coming. Still got time for a few more if you want to pop them in the chat box. Martin was asking about, is there a way of measuring soil organic matter by electroconductivity? Thought it was an area of research that seems to have gone quiet. Paul, you were saying that, or do you want to expand on your answer a bit? And maybe Becky, you know about that as well.
Yeah.
Well, I've answered a little bit from my point of view, but Becky, do you want to say more than that?
Yeah, so I would just say that we are about to start an ELMS test and trial looking at this, because there are a range of soil scanners out there now in terms of that are either using electroconductivity or are using near infrared spectroscopy and all these other options that are out there now. We don't know how accurate they are, and we don't know what they do in terms of looking at, as Paul's written in his answer, we don't know about what's going on with depth. They're very good at looking at different soil types across the field and allowing you to apply, to look at nutrient applications and potentially look at how you're managing the field. But when we start to look at what's going further deeper in the soil, are they any good? So as I say, we're about to start a test and trial where we're working with 3 different sorts of scanners, one of which is an electroconductivity scanner, one which is an infrared spectroscopy scanner, and one that's looking at using sort of magnetic resonance images, as well as looking at what's available in terms of some of that satellite data and that LiDAR data. Because what I said earlier about we're looking at what's going on with in-field variation, the bit of work that Northwick are leading on is looking at how variable soil carbon is across a field. And so where we're doing sort of 15 GPS log samples per 15 hectares, some of those they're going back and they've analysed each of those points, and where they found variation, they've got 150 points in a field where they've analysed. So we've got really, really good base data upon which we can run these scanners, we can fly these satellites to actually see whether they actually stand up to what we could use. Because you're completely right, the whole area of how do we make this cost effective, how do we do the validation in a way which is cost effective is really, really important and traceable and validated. So if these scanners can provide robust information and can do it in a way which is cost effective and traceable, then that will be really, really useful.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. Right, we've got a couple more questions in, so hopefully we'll have time. So are there benchmarks for soil types such as heavy clay in a valley versus brash on chalk uplands?
Yeah, so depending on your soil type, there will be, and I think, do they have it in the Landis data set, Paul? Do they have sort of the range of soil organic matter data?
No, they don't. They have the soil type, but not the organic matter data. No.
But certainly there are data sets out there which have those sort of benchmarks in terms of and this is one of the things that we need to look at in terms of saying that all soils have to achieve, 8% or whatever. It's very difficult for some soil types to get there because of, the underlying rock and the mineral and everything that's in there. So certainly in terms of benchmarks, yes, they do exist. But what I would say is it's always worth, benchmarking a lot with what you've got currently, and then looking at potentially, if you had it within your field, you can look at what's going on, potentially in an area which is, heavily trafficked versus an area which isn't, looking at permanent pasture versus cropping, so that you can start to see what the potential is and the thresholds are within your soil type. But it's certainly something that that we probably need a little bit more information on, so that people can start to appreciate what the potential is within their soil type. Although some of the I was talking to the other guys earlier this morning about it, if we just look at organic matter percentage, it's sort of sometimes a bit of a blunt instrument, and so one of the things that we're looking at is looking at carbon yield, and actually looking at how how the carbon is made up within the soil. And we found that those soils that potentially are, if you were looking at a sort of carbon saturation percentage, you can actually start to be pulling it further down. So yeah, I think there will be more of this information coming, and I think it's how we measure it and what the metrics are that we use is important as well.
Brilliant, thank you. I think coming up to 7, but what are your thoughts concerning microbial inoculants, both commercial and DIY, e.g. milk diluted with water? Don't know if anyone's... Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I know. I was just going to say we've got a few of the farmers in our research trial that are doing some work, and some are applying different sorts of inoculants. I would say that I haven't, in some cases they can work quite well, and in other cases they work less well. So I think what we probably need is some good, robust research that's done on the potential of these sort of things. A lot of it seems to be commercially driven, and I would hate to think that actually we were buying stuff that that actually was just a bit of a waste of money. I think if we can concentrate on I think the whole area of soil biology is so exciting, and there's so much potential with it. I think as Paul said in his presentation, it's about getting the basics right to start off with. So looking at things like what's our sort of fungal to bacterial ratio. Are we doing practices, and are we doing things that we're actually supporting our soil biology? And then then starting to look at the potential for adding things in terms of inoculants or humates or fulvic acid or any of these sort of things. I think as we start to, the other thing to look at is how what are you doing on the rest of your farming system? So if you're doing things that are potentially damaging the soil biology, so that may be cultivation, that may be applying fertilizer, that may be applying ag chem, then it may be that you want to put you want to sort of try and if you're doing something that's potentially negative to the soil, you want to put something on. And some of the farmers that I've got that are doing it are doing that at the same time, in terms of putting something positive in at the same time as to sort of mitigate that bad thing that they're doing. But again, I think we need a lot more research in terms of their potential over the commercial scale.
Brilliant, thank you. I think we've probably just got one more. There's a question, it's about in Africa, but I guess it applies anywhere where data is a gap. Are there key indicators that can support soil carbon practice? We've got some simple soil test videos that we could send round in an email afterwards about tests that you can do with just a spade. I don't know if there's anything else that you would add to that, Becky.
Aggregate stability. You can do it, as I say, you can do it. You can literally, you don't have to have any kit, and as I say, you've probably got a lot of sunshine, whereas you don't, it won't take so long to dry the soil out before you look at putting it in water. It's a really, really good indicator, and certainly some of my colleagues at Northwick have been doing this doing this test around the world, and it's really, really good. In terms of looking at practice, and those practices, the sort of, it's the golden soil health principles. It's disturb it less, keep it covered, try and keep it protected, and have diversity of roots and diversity of sources of organic matter that are going in. So those are the practices that you sort of want to underpin. And then in terms of providing that evidence, certainly aggregate stability, and as I say, I can share the protocol for that, and in another couple of months we should have some thresholds on the carbon levels. And yeah, that's a really good thing that you can do. It doesn't cost anything. You don't need to have a lab set up. Anyone can do it.
Brilliant. I think on that note, that sounds like a good place to end. Thank you ever so much for speaking. Thank you, Becky. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone else who's joined us. We will follow up with an email with the slides and the recording from today's session. I think there might have been a couple of questions that we didn't get to, so I'll send those around to the team. Hopefully we'll be able to reply to you. But do get in touch if anything else comes to mind. And have a lovely evening. Enjoy the sunshine. Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Becky. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.